Hi, everyone called her a mate killer. After her mate was found dead in the forest, she was chained and sentenced to execution without a chance to defend herself. When the feared Alpha King arrived to carry out her punishment himself, she accepted that her life was over. But the moment his eyes fell on the strange birthmark on her neck, he froze. Then, in front of the entire kingdom, the Alpha King gave an order that left everyone speechless. They dragged Alara Rossi through the courtyard at dawn, chains biting into her wrists, her bare feet scraping cold stone. No one spoke for her. She killed her mate. She deserves to die. That's what they whispered over and over until it almost sounded like truth. Alara didn't fight. She didn't beg, because she already knew how this would end. She, known it for weeks, ever since they came for her in the middle of the night and threw her in that cell with nothing but a bucket and a thin blanket that smelled like mold. She cried herself dry in there. There were no tears left in her now, just cold. Just the ache in her shoulders from the chains and the deeper ache in her chest that never seemed to go away, not since the day she married Alessandro. The crowd pressed in on both sides of the courtyard, packed shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks to see her. Some of them spat. Some of them just stared, the way people stare at something they're glad isn't happening to them. Alara kept her eyes on the stones beneath her feet, counting them, anything to keep from looking up at what was waiting for her. At the center of the courtyard stood the platform, dark wood, stained with years of use. And beside it, still as a statue, stood Alpha King Matteo Vanni. He didn't look like a man about to take a life. He looked carved out of something colder than stone, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back like he'd done this 100 times and felt nothing each time. The guards shoved Alara forward until she stood at the base of the platform, close enough now to see the gold trim on his coat, the way the morning light caught the sharp line of his cheekbones. Alara Rossi, his voice carried over the whole courtyard, deep and even. You stand accused of murdering your mate, Alessandro Conti. Do you have anything to say before sentencing? She lifted her chin. Her voice came out cracked, barely above a whisper, but steady. Would it matter if I did? Something flickered behind his eyes, just for a second, gone before she could name it. No tears, he said, more to himself than to her. No fear. That should have made this easy for him. She could see it in the way his shoulders eased, just slightly, like her silence was permission. He turned to the executioner, a broad man with an axe resting against his shoulder, and gave a single nod. Alara closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's kitchen back before any of this happened, the smell of bread baking, the sound of her mother humming some old tune while she worked. She held onto that smell, that sound, because it was the only soft thing she had left to hold on to. The executioner stepped forward. The crowd went quiet, that terrible kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. And then, right as the axe lifted, a gust of wind caught the torn edge of Alara's collar and pulled it sideways, just enough. Matteo saw it before anyone else did. A mark, just beneath her collarbone, crescent-shaped, pale silver against her skin like it had been burned there by something not of this world. His whole body went rigid. His breath caught somewhere in his throat and refused to move. He knew that mark. He'd read about it in books older than his own bloodline. He'd been told stories about it as a boy, half believing them, half dismissing them as the kind of thing old men say to make the world feel less ordinary. He never thought he'd see it. Not on her. Not on anyone. Stop! The word tore out of him before he even decided to say it. The executioner's axe was already falling. Matteo moved faster than thought, faster than reason, his hand closing around the blade itself, the steel biting into his palm, blood running hot and immediate down his wrist and onto the platform. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to feel it. The crowd gasped as one. Somewhere behind Alara, a woman screamed. Alara opened her eyes. The king of Valorosa was on one knee in front of her, his blood dripping onto the stone between them, his eyes locked on the mark at her collarbone like he'd just seen the dead come back to life. Who told you to hide this? His voice shook now, not with anger, with something rower than that. Alara's mouth opened, but no words came. She didn't understand the question. She didn't understand any of this. All she knew was that the axe had stopped, that her heart was still beating, hammering so hard against her ribs it hurt, and that the man who was supposed to kill her was looking at her like she was something sacred. "She is not to be touched." Matteo rose to his feet, turning to face the crowd, his bloodied hand raised so all of them could see it. "By order of the crown, this execution is halted, effective immediately." Murmurs rippled through the courtyard, confusion and disbelief passing from face to face. Somewhere near the front, Alara caught sight of a man in council robes, his expression carefully blank, but his eyes sharp and cold as they moved between her and the king. Matteo turned back to her. Up close, she could see the storm behind his eyes had not settled. If anything, it had only grown. "You're coming with me." "Why?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. He looked at her for a long moment, like he was deciding how much truth she could hold right now. "Because you are not who they say you are," he said finally. "And I think, for a very long time, neither did you." He cut the chains from her wrists himself, his bloodied hand steady despite the wound still bleeding freely. The guards stepped back, unsure, looking to him for some order that made sense of what they'd just witnessed. None came. He simply offered Alara his uninjured hand. She stared at it, stared at the blood drying on his knuckles, the crescent mark still burning faintly silver against her own skin in the morning light. She didn't know this man. She didn't trust this man. But the axe was gone, and the platform was empty, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was still breathing when she shouldn't have been. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. The fortress was colder than Alara expected. Stone walls, high ceilings, the kind of quiet that made every footstep echo twice. They walked her through hallways lined with old portraits, men in armor with eyes that seemed to follow her, until they reached a chamber tucked away from the rest, far from prying ears. Matteo's hand was still bleeding when they arrived. A healer rushed in within minutes, wrapping his palm in white cloth that turned red almost immediately. He waved off her concern, his eyes never leaving Alara, who stood near the door like she still expected someone to drag her back to that platform. "Sit," he said, not a command, more like he was asking, just dressed up as one because he didn't know how else to say it. She didn't move. "Why am I here?" "Because 3 hours ago I was ready to let an axe fall on your neck, and now I can't stop looking at the mark on your collarbone like it's the only real thing in this room." He said it flat, no softness to it, but his hand trembled slightly as he said it, just enough that she caught it. Alara wrapped her arms around herself. The dress they'd given her was clean, warm, nothing like the rags she'd worn in that cell. It made her skin crawl a little, how easily comfort could be handed to her now, like it was always there waiting, like she hadn't spent weeks freezing on a stone floor. "That mark," she said quietly. "What is it?" Matteo sat down across from her, wincing as he flexed his bandaged hand. "It's called a blood-bound mark. It only appears on one person for one king, once in a lifetime, sometimes not at all. My father searched for his for 40 years and never found her. I stopped believing it was real for me a long time ago. And now you think it's me." "I don't think it, I know it." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, like saying it out loud made it heavier than he expected. Alara looked down at her hands, at the faint red lines still pressed into her wrists from the chains. "I don't know what that means for me. I don't know what you want from me." "I don't want anything from you," he said. "Not yet. I just want to know who put that mark on you and why someone worked so hard to make sure I never saw it." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller than before, like she was pulling the words up from somewhere deep and painful. "Alessandro never let me wear anything that showed my collarbone. Not once, not even in summer. I thought it was because he was jealous, controlling. I didn't think." She stopped, swallowing hard. "I didn't think there was a reason behind it." Matteo leaned forward. "Did he ever say anything? Anything strange? People he met with, things he kept hidden?" Alara thought back, sifting through years she'd rather forget. "He used to disappear for days, said it was business. He'd come back different sometimes, quieter, like something had scared him." She paused. "Once I heard him on the phone real late at night, saying something like, 'She still doesn't know what she is, and she won't, not if you keep paying me.'" Mateo's jaw tightened. Paying him for what? I don't know. I never found out who he was talking to. Her voice shook now, the calm she'd been holding onto starting to crack. I lived with that man for 3 years, Mateo. 3 years of him telling me I was nothing, that no one would ever want me, that I was lucky he even looked at me twice. And the whole time he was being paid to keep me hidden from you. Saying it out loud seemed to break something open in her. Her hands started shaking, and she pressed them against her knees to try and stop it, but it didn't work. Mateo watched her for a moment, then did something she didn't expect. He reached over, slow, careful, like she was something that might shatter if he moved too fast, and placed his uninjured hand over hers. You're safe here, he said quietly. Whatever happens next, that part is true. She wanted to pull away. Some old instinct in her told her not to trust a man's gentle voice, not after Alessandro had used a gentle voice plenty of times before turning cruel. But something about the warmth of his hand, steady and real, made her stay still instead. Why didn't you find me sooner? She whispered. If this Mark is real, if I'm supposed to be yours, why did you let me marry him? Why did you let me suffer for 3 years before any of this mattered to you? Mateo's eyes dropped, something heavy passing over his face. I've asked myself that same question since this morning, and the only honest answer I have is, I don't know. I searched for my mate when I was younger. I searched until I convinced myself I was searching for something that didn't exist. Then I stopped. He looked back up at her. I stopped looking, Alara, and while I stopped, someone made sure I never would have found you anyway. A knock cut through the room before she could answer. A guard stepped in, bowing low. My king, Councilman Renzo requests an audience. He says it concerns the woman. Mateo's whole body went still in a way that made Alara's stomach drop. Tell him I'll see him in the hall, not here. The guard nodded and left. Mateo turned back to Alara, and for just a second, the careful control on his face slipped, replaced by something close to worry. Stay in this room, he said. Don't open that door for anyone but me. Why, who is Renzo? Mateo stood, his bandaged hand curling into a fist at his side. Someone who has a great deal of interest in making sure that mark on your collarbone never sees the light of day again. He left before she could ask anything else, the door closing behind him with a heavy, final sound. Alara sat alone in the quiet of that room, her hand still warm from where his had been, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of dying anymore. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of being killed. She was afraid of being hidden again. The Rite of the Sun came 3 weeks later, and the Great Hall of Valorosa had never been so full. Every lord, every lady, every council member from every corner of the kingdom packed into that room, gold light pouring through the tall windows, the air thick with perfume and tension. Alara stood near the back at first, hidden in a dark blue gown, until Mateo's guard came to walk her forward. She felt every eye in the room land on her the moment she stepped into the light. Whispers followed her like a current, the same whispers from the courtyard weeks before. Murderous. The whispers hadn't stopped just because the axe had. Councilman Renzo stood at the front beside the throne, his robes pressed crisp, his face calm in a way that made Alara's skin crawl. She learned enough in 3 weeks to know that calm, on a man like that, was never a good sign. My king, Renzo said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. On this sacred day, I bring forward a matter of grave importance. This woman, Alara Rossi, murdered her mate in cold blood. The crown halted her execution on the basis of a mark which has never been verified, never been tested. I ask the council, are we to set aside centuries of law on the word of a king too taken with a pretty face to see clearly? Ripple of murmurs swept the hall. Alara's hands curled into fists at her sides, her nails biting into her palms. She thought of the cold stone floor of her cell, the chains, the bucket in the corner, the months of being told by men like Renzo exactly what she was worth. Something old and tired in her finally cracked open. I didn't kill Alessandro. Her voice rang out before she even decided to speak, steady despite the shake in her hands. But you already know that, don't you, councilman? Because you're the one who was paying him. The hall went dead silent. Renzo's calm face twitched just barely, but Alara saw it. That's a serious accusation, he said carefully. It's the truth. Alara stepped forward, past Mateo, past the guards, until she stood in the center of the hall where everyone could see her. He told someone on the phone, late one night, that I still didn't know what I was, and that he'd keep it that way as long as he kept getting paid. I heard it with my own ears. I just didn't understand it until 3 weeks ago. Lies, Renzo snapped, though his voice had lost some of its smoothness. Desperate lies from a woman trying to save her own neck. Mateo rose from his throne. The whole hall seemed to hold its breath as he walked down the steps, past the council, until he stood beside Alara instead of above her. I have spent 3 weeks going through every record of payment that left this fortress in the last 5 years, Mateo said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. 3 weeks finding what someone worked very hard to bury. There is a paper trail, Renzo, one that leads from your private accounts straight to Alessandro Conti. Renzo's face drained of color. My king, this is. My brother helped you, didn't he? Mateo's voice cracked on the word brother, the first real break in his composure since Alara had met him. He couldn't take the throne from me by force, so the two of you decided to make sure I never found the one person who could strengthen my claim to it. You hid her in plain sight. You let a good woman suffer for years so neither of you would lose your grip on this kingdom. The hall erupted into noise, shouting, gasping, council members turning on each other in confusion and fear. Renzo took a step back, his hand reaching for something hidden in his robes. But before he could move further, Mateo turned to Alara and took her hand in front of every single person in that room. I stand with her, he said, loud enough that it silenced the chaos. Not because of a mark on her skin, because of who she is underneath it. A woman who survived everything you all did to her and still walked back into this hall and told the truth even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. The moment his hand closed around hers, something happened that no one in that hall could deny. The crescent mark on Alara's collarbone began to glow, soft and silver at first, then bright enough that gasps rippled through the crowd. Light spread from the mark down her arm, into Mateo's hand, climbing up between them like something ancient finally waking up after a very long sleep. Renzo stumbled back from the light like it burned him. This is impossible. The bloodline curse was supposed to. He stopped himself too late. The hall had already heard it. Curse. The word landed heavy in the silence that followed, and Alara watched as understanding spread across the faces of the council, one by one, as the truth Renzo had just confirmed with his own mouth settled over the room. Guards moved before Mateo even gave the order, surrounding Renzo, pulling his arms behind his back as he shouted denials no one was listening to anymore. Alara watched it happen with tears finally slipping down her face, not from fear this time, but from something that felt almost too big for her chest to hold. When the hall finally quieted, when Renzo was gone and the council sat stunned in their seats, Mateo turned to her. The light from the mark had faded, but his hand was still wrapped around hers, warm and steady. 3 years, he said quietly, just for her. 3 years I should have spent looking harder, fighting harder, finding you sooner. I can't give those years back to you, but I can promise you every year after this one. Alara looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had once stood ready to take her life and instead gave her back her name, her truth, her worth. I don't need a king to save me, she said softly. I think I've spent my whole life waiting for someone to do that, and it never worked. Then what do you need? She thought about it for a long moment, the whole hall watching, waiting. Someone who sees me as more than a mark on my skin or a body to control. Someone who stands beside me, not in front of me. Motto's mouth curved into the first real smile she'd seen from him since the courtyard. Then, that's what I'll be. Outside the tall windows, the sun climbed higher over Valorosa, spilling gold across the stone floor where a king and the woman he almost executed stood together, hand in hand, no longer ruler and prisoner, but two people finally choosing each other, equal and unafraid.